on the Sabbath, or whether his disciples were eating the heads of grain. You remember basically walking through the field and eating the grain, and they accused them of harvesting grain, just all kinds of things like that. But Jesus makes a statement here in this text, Mark 2, verses 27 and 28, that I think is really significant. And I want you to remember this. Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, he said, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Of course, being Lord is the authority or the ruler over it, but Jesus is exerting the fact that he has the authority. He knows, he knows the ins and outs of these commandments related to the Sabbath. And he says, here's the thing. Man was created before the Sabbath was ever instituted. So the Sabbath was actually made for man's benefit, and not man just to be burdened down by Sabbath observance. It's a pretty significant concept to grasp. So please kind of put that in your computer there. Mark chapter 2, verses 27, 28. You'll also probably remember from our study last time that in Mark chapter 3, Jesus chose or called to himself 12 apostles. Do you remember what the word apostle means?
The one who decided with the commission, one holding the commission.
Okay, all right. Very simply, it's one who's sent with a commission. So that is that there is a particular work to be done, and then they are sent out to go do that work. In this case, Jesus himself chose 12 apostles. And of course, throughout their association with each other, they're going to be commissioned with lots of different works. Ultimately, we usually think about the Great Commission that was given to them, but as we've been seeing, there are all kinds of works that Jesus has sent them to do, and we're going to see a few more of those in our study here today, Lord willing. And then there was another moment that was very significant in our study last time, and that was that, Jesus has been doing all of this healing, and also in those places where he's doing healing, invariably they would bring to him people that were demon possessed, and Jesus would cast out the demons. And there was just a lot of instances of that. But his opposition, I guess, grew tired of all of the acclaim that he's receiving everywhere he goes, and people seeking him out for the removal of these demons, which was something that these religious leaders, I suppose, were unable to do. And so they get really frustrated with Jesus. So it ultimately comes down to the scribes saying that Jesus was being empowered by someone to cast out those demons. And they were saying, well, it isn't God who is doing it. Instead, who is it that the scribes said was empowering Jesus to cast out these demons? Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. Okay. All right. Just a few little things, little tidbits out of the study that we had last time. And I thank you for your being here tonight. Okay, we're going to start in Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. Jesus is coming from Nazareth in the region of Galilee, and he's been having quite a bit of success as he's gone across the lake, the sea, and doing these miracles and teaching such that when he's in places, great multitudes of people assemble. And, we even noticed together that he told or instructed his disciples to actually have a boat there in the water so that in case the crowds became so great and pressed against him, he would actually get in the boat and go out a little bit so that there would be a little bit of distance between him and the crowds. They pressed on him so much, wanted to be near him. And so Jesus is returning home. And some interesting things happen when he does that. Chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. Then he went out from there. So he'd been across the water. He's going to come back across. When he went out from there, came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many hearing him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things?" Now, they're astonished, which means they're shocked at what they're hearing. They know Jesus, but they're like, where in the world did he learn to talk like this? And what wisdom is this which is given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? So they were offended at him. And that word offended there, a lot of times it's translated with the idea of someone or something being a stumbling block. So the idea is that they're so astonished at what is happening that they can't quite reconcile the person that they knew, Jesus, the son of Mary. They can't quite reconcile that with what they're now experiencing with him being such a great teacher and having been empowered to do these miraculous things. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house. It's pretty well a proverb. I actually, several years ago, I was invited to go back to my hometown where I grew up as a child in order to hold a gospel meeting. And keep in mind, I had been preaching at that time, 20 some years. But when I went back home to preach, I kind of got the same reaction that Jesus is getting. Not that it was to that level, but I kind of understand what Jesus is saying here. And that is, you go outside, far away from home, you do your work, you grow, you gain knowledge and experience. Then when you return home, it's like people don't know you that way. They just remember how you were as a child. In fact, I had somebody on that occasion, they said, "Kenny, we didn't ever think about you becoming a preacher." It's like that was the farthest thing from our minds. But in verse 5, he says now, or the text says now, he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, presumably because of this inability for the folks just to wrap their minds around what's happening. And he marveled because of their unbelief. Then he went about the villages in a circuit teaching. We don't know this particular fact right here I'm about to share with you from the book of Mark because it wasn't covered. But if we were doing a parallel study, like I told you earlier, there are 3 other gospels, and especially 2 of them, Matthew and Luke, follow along very much the same as Mark does, tells a lot of the same stories. In Luke chapter 4, especially verse 29, the people that were in Jesus's hometown, actually, with regard to what we're reading here in Mark, probably about a year ago, those folks tried to kill Jesus. They thought that he was totally out of his mind. And so Jesus has been away from home for about a year. He's been doing all this good work, and now he has graciously returned, and he's given them another opportunity to know him. They thought they really knew him, before because he'd grown up there. But now, as he's coming doing these amazing things, they're having trouble reconciling. Isn't this the carpenter? How could this same carpenter, be the Son of God? They're amazed at his wisdom. They're amazed at what he's able to say, and they're just having a tough time with it. I guess in some ways, familiarity of the wrong kind that encourages unbelief. Since they can't reconcile it, they're just like, we don't want to have anything to do with it. And because of that unbelief that's developed in them, Jesus pretty well astonished that they're so unbelieving, despite the signs that he's showing. It was going to rob them of their blessing. So Jesus is left just to wonder or to marvel at their unbelief. What do you think about that? You ever have any experience where you've been away from your hometown for a while, you return and you get a response that you really didn't expect?
There's this saying in Afrikaans, basically said, familiarity breeds contempt.
Okay, yeah. There's our word too, right? You become too familiar to the extent that, well, I mean, I don't know if this is it exactly, but it's like, you're one of us. So for you to kind of grow or excel above us, maybe that makes us a little jealous. We're a little jealous that you're one of us, you went out there and you've become this. It kind of, that in that sense, familiarity does breed some discontent. People they don't like what they see, not because you're not amazing and wonderful, it's just because they're jealous.
Contempt. Familiarity
Okay.
breeds contempt, which is
Okay.
like in verachting. What is it's like I'm now thinking in Afrikaans and I'm sitting with a word in English. It's like almost like looking down upon.
Yeah.
Disgust is the word that you're looking for.
Pardon?
Disgusting.
Disgust. Yeah.
Yes.
Disgust.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, same concept. I don't like it. I know you well enough that now that you've made good, I don't like it. I think that probably just stems out of a development of jealousy in a person's heart. They just don't want to see you do well. So we had the 12 that were introduced to us in chapter 3. We've been going around with them for a little while. They've been experiencing the miracles that Jesus has been working. They've been hearing the parables that he's been teaching. And although there is some, I'm sure that Jesus is a little bit discouraged in the fact that they've not grown like they should have, but there has been some growth. And in fact, they've gotten to the place now where Jesus is starting to trust them with his own ministry. And so we were talking about apostleship and how that is related to a commission, given a work to do and go out and do it. And here, beginning at verse 7, Jesus is about to send them out to do work for him. And he called the 12 to himself and began to send them out 2 by 2, gave them power over unclean spirits. He commanded them to take nothing for the journey except a staff. No bag, no bread, no copper in their money belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. So, they're going pretty lean. They're traveling very light. Also, he said to them, in whatever place you enter a house, stay there till you depart from that place. And whoever will not receive you, nor hear you, when you depart from there, shake off the dust under your feet as a testimony against them. assuredly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. So, with this commission, they went out and preached that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. So, talk about their commission. Here, the 12 are like ambassadors for Jesus. They've been commissioned, they've been empowered to work miracles. They can go and they can serve and they can teach wherever Jesus sends them. Now, if you were to compare Mark's account with what Matthew talks about in Matthew chapter 10, Matthew's section is way larger. And we've talked about that before. There are a lot of details there in Matthew that Mark is not interested in at all. What is of particular note is that Mark actually omits the mention that Jesus makes that this was to be primarily a ministry to the Jews. He doesn't mention that at all. And given the fact that most folks think that the book of Mark was aimed at Gentile readers, it kind of seems like maybe that was an opportune omission in the sense that, if you just kind of characterize this as a teaching mission, given that actually later in this section that we're going to study here today, you're going to find out that Jesus interacts quite a lot with some Gentile folks to maybe give a glimpse of how the gospel wasn't just going to be relegated to the Gentiles, but was ultimately going to be spread to the entire world. And the compassion and the care that Jesus has just kind of comes out in that. There doesn't seem to have been, a whole lot of urgency about the work that they were going to do. Jesus told them, don't go get any new equipment. Don't be encumbered with a bunch of stuff that you don't need. It's going to be like a short trip. And wherever you go, the few needs that you have, those are going to be met. Don't worry about it. Jesus basically encouraging them, as he has been striving to encourage them all along, is, trust God for your provisions. Live by faith. That was a great lesson for them. I'm going to say that as regards our travel through life, maybe we would all benefit from traveling a little bit lighter too. If our mission is to spread the gospel, then preaching that word and leading people to Jesus really begins with the example that we set in the life we're living before them. So as they look at us, they take a cue from our experience in serving Jesus as kind of a light into the idea of how their life is going to be when they serve Jesus too. So what do you think about the nature of the work that they were going to do? They were themselves doing miracles and they were also teaching, but think about how they weren't to carry hardly anything with them. What do you think about a work like that?
Brother Ken,
Yes.
I think let's take the focus of Judas Iscariot for a while. If the fact that Jesus chose him, he saw the value of Judas.
Yeah.
It's only after he allowed Satan, to follow his command, that is only when he disappointed Jesus. So, looking at that situation, I personally think that everybody has a chance in life, and your decision will ultimately determine where you're going to go one day.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's true too. Yes. Here's something for us, Isaac, and that is, we're a ways away from ultimately Judas making that fateful decision to betray the Lord and all that was wrapped up in that. I don't know how that's developing in his heart at this stage, but yeah, you're exactly right. If we could, if we could guard ourselves day by day, like I was thinking yesterday of all days. I just honestly, I had a great day. I felt super productive, and it ended with Bible study, with the church and fellowship with the brethren. And I just, at the end of the day, in my prayer to God, I just thanked him for an extraordinary day. And so, you know how I began today? I thought to myself, today can also be a great and extraordinary day. When we start looking, way on down the road, maybe that's when we become a little frightened or uncertain. But wouldn't it be better if we were like these disciples right here? Jesus teaching them a pretty valuable lesson, I think. Let's don't plan too far ahead. Let's try to just take today for what today holds, do the best that we can today, keep our I think that point that Isaac makes is pretty appropriate here. Things can get off the rails, things can go awry pretty quickly. But boy, what about just today? Let's just hold it together today, and then pray the Lord comes tomorrow, right? But um, anybody else have something to say about that? Wow, it's all been said. Amazing.
It makes me think of the 12 spies in Joshua as well.
Do what now?
It makes me think of the 12 spies, also 2 by 2.
Oh, yeah.
The teamwork that you naturally get, and then the bond of friendship that the two of you, I mean, the two of us is better friends than the two of us, than two of
Yeah,
because they in the same group. You know what I mean?
absolutely. I think that's your experience. My experience has been exactly the same. I used to have, I do now too, but I remember years ago, I used to have a coworker, Tom Neal. He and I would go do visits together. And I remember this one particular occasion where we had walked up to a property where we were going to speak with a lady that had visited with us at the church and had indicated an interest in knowing more about the church. So we arrived at her property, but as soon as we got there, I could hear them. There were dogs barking, 2 or 3 of them. There were several abandoned types of vehicles around in the yard. There were 2 homes, but there were no lights on. It was getting dark. And I'll be honest with you, if I had been by myself, I would have stayed in my car and turned around and maybe gone to the next address. I would have dropped it. But my friend Tom said, well, I hear the dogs barking. Maybe somebody's home. I wanted to tell him, are you crazy? We're not going in there. But he said, no, let's go check. We're here, let's go check. And so with the confidence of my friend, we got out of the car. We walked up to one of the houses and knocked on the door. And guess who came to the door? It was that lady. And we had a tremendous conversation with her. And ultimately, she was able to come back to our church services. And I've oftentimes remembered, even when I'm alone and I go to visit and I think, I don't know, I'll remember about what Tom said, let's go. Let's don't be afraid. And I think 2 people working together really help to encourage one another to greater heights. It's like, each of us have value, but when we work together, we multiply the value in our work together. So yeah, I think it's a tremendous thing. The example that Jesus sets here in sending them two by two. You're better encouraged, better encouraged. Okay, we're entering into a dark period right here. We're gonna learn some great details about John the Baptist and his death. It's just like I don't know, it's like we're going along, talking. All of a sudden, we stop in order to deal with an event that was significant in the life of Jesus and how his ministry was going to go forward. And it really seems to ignite what it is that Jesus is doing. Verse 14. Now, King Herod, and by the way, Herod wasn't actually a king. Herod liked people to call him a king. He was what was referred to in Roman terminology. He was a tetrarch. Now, Judea was set into or dissected into about 4 regions, and Herod was a governor of one of those 4 regions that included this territory that Jesus is in, or in Jerusalem. So King Herod heard of him, heard of Jesus, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. And others said, it's Elijah. And others still said, it's the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, this is John whom I beheaded. He's been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Herod had married his brother Philip's wife. He was in an adulterous relationship with this woman. And John didn't let it lie. John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore, not Herod, but Herodias held it against him and wanted him killed. But she could not, for Herod actually feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want and I'll give it to you. He also swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom. So she went out and asked her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, so he felt the pressure of it, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately, king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Oh boy. So even though Herod had been rebuked by John the Baptist, Herod himself actually feared taking any action against John, so he just kind of basically took it. But Herodias, she's sitting in the background and she is seething with anger and malice toward John the Baptist, such that when the daughter has the opportunity basically for anything at all that she wants, And you know, most people, and I'm sure Herod was thinking the same thing, that most people, when given that opportunity, would say, well, give me some money or give me a piece of property or something like that. But Herodias has this seething anger and malice growing in her to the extent that when she's asked, what up to half the kingdom would you want? She says, I want John the Baptist. I want him dead. I want his head on a platter. Well, Herod himself had heard perhaps the greatest prophet that God had ever sent. And yet he had refused to submit to the word of God. Herod's indecision in this, you know, what do we do? What do we do? Pressure from his guests, pressure from the wife. That took him from just being this adulterer, now he's become a murderer. Instead of heeding the word of God, he tried to silence the word of God by killing John the Baptist. And is that really it?
Sorry. He should have just said to her, man, John the Baptist is in the upper side of the kingdom. The one I'm killing.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, her hatred was such that just, I mean, just the seething anger. A lot of times, maybe you've experienced this. I sure have, where you're just, you know, you're a happy person. You love everybody. I tell the congregation here how much I want everybody here to go to heaven. But sometimes you will preach or teach a message from the Word of God that steps on some people's toes, or that word convicts them of sin that they're participating in. Here's what should happen. What should happen is that they hear that word for what it is, and they just repent. They do the right thing. There are some occasions, however, where people, instead of thinking, wait a minute, this actually is true, this is what God expects of me, and I should change, instead of getting angry at God for having said those words, what they do is they look at the messenger and they say, you know, you are the one that has brought this pain into my life. You are the one that has brought this accusation of my sin. When in reality, all you've been trying to do is to be a minister to them. You've been trying to share with them what God says. It wasn't you. You're just the messenger, you know. People want to always kill the messenger. Well, John the Baptist was nothing more than a messenger of God, and
The,
they wanted to they wanted to shut him up. Yes, sir, Isaac.
I was thinking you're talking about John the Baptist. What about God in the flesh? He was a teacher, and
Absolutely.
they also killed him.
They're gonna do everything they can now to get rid of him too. Absolutely right. Yes, sir. Only thing is, at this time, John the Baptist had gone to the top. You know, he went right to the top, but he said, "You can't have her." Well, Herod, the fashioning himself as a king, Herod the king, he doesn't expect anybody to. He doesn't expect for anybody to speak to him in any way except to glorify him or to pick him up or to tell him how great he is. But instead, John the Baptist has come along and he said, Herod, you've got sin in your life and you can't have that woman. Wow. That also tells us a little bit, doesn't it, about being no respecter of persons. You know, we don't preach one message to one group of people and another message to this other group of people simply because we're afraid it might offend them, or we want to maintain their favor. Herod or John the Baptist was not that way at all, and neither should we be. We just speak the truth in love, and we are trusting that God's word is going to do what it was intended to do, as Isaiah said. Unfortunately, sometimes the anger comes right at us. We're told, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So you and I, sometimes we're going to receive the brunt of it, but in those times we ought to just feel joyful for the opportunity to suffer for the sake of Jesus. Okay, we're going to move on to what is, I don't know if we should, I guess the absolute greatest miracle is coming, and that is Jesus Christ raised from the dead. That is the miracle to end all miracles. But second to that is apparently the miracle that God thought was so extraordinary and so impactful that not only will we be reading about it here in the book of Mark, but you also read about it in Matthew and Luke and John as well. In fact, it's basically one of two that are included in all of the gospel accounts, the other being the resurrection of Jesus. So there's no doubt about it, the feeding of the 5,000 is an extraordinary miracle that God wants us to pay attention to. Now, what's unique in this book will be the details that come out in it. So the apostles, verse 30, the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. So they've been busy going out two by two. They've been to these villages. Wow, Lord, we just can't wait to debrief. We want to share with you everything that's happened. And he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest for a while. Of course, they're tired. For there were many coming and going, and they didn't even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. So send them away that they may buy for themselves bread. Verse 37. He answered and said to them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? Do we even have that kind of money? A huge amount of food, Lord, is going to be needed. But he said, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5, that's 5 loaves, and 2 fish. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now, those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. So The 12, they'd been sent out by Jesus. They return, they report all that's been done through them. And after this intensive time of ministry, wow, they're exhausted. They need some rest, and they go off by themselves. Jesus tries to withdraw from the crowds, but he wasn't successful. It kind of a side light that here's Jesus, the servant, seeking to save folks. He didn't have time to rest for himself. People follow him everywhere he goes. And it looks to him like, there's just like a bunch of wandering sheep out there without any shepherd. And because of that, he has compassion on them. He draws them to himself, and he teaches them, and he feeds them. Now, it's interesting, just one of many things that you might point out here, but the disciples, when they looked at the situation, their solution was to go and buy some bread. We don't have the money for it, but I guess what you're saying is that you want us to go and buy some stuff. That's verse 37. But Jesus's solution was, the first thing you need to do is go and see. Verse 38. And I was thinking, ultimately they do go and see, and they find 2 loaves and 5 loaves and 2 little fish. But it seems to me that when God gives you something to do, instead of thinking about what we don't have, maybe we ought to think about what we do have. This miracle that Jesus works about multiplying things, that takes place in his hands. Jesus is the manufacturer. The disciples were just the distributors of what he gave them. It seems to me that God can make an awful lot out of so very little. But first, we need to discover what little it is that we do have. Yes? Okay, yes, comment.
Thinking of the widow of Zarephath, thinking in First Kings 18, she had to first give, I think,
All she had.
she had to give first to Elijah, and then with herself and her son, and she said, I'm going to eat this and I'm going to die. So you first took care of others' needs before but use what you had, but you had to use what you had.
Yeah. Can I also say that at least concerned enough to notice that there's a problem, They didn't know.
Yeah, I like that comment, because almost always they are non-observant. It's like they're always totally out of the game. But yeah, that is a good point. They give them some credit, right? They did happen to notice
Yeah,
these
that
people need some food.
noticing came right after their intensive ministry. So,
Yeah.
so they were like almost prepared to notice.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea. You're exactly right. They have been out. They've been giving of themselves. Yeah, you do see in that a kind of a great development. However, Jesus is, how do I put this? Jesus is okay, you've done great, and you've learned that lesson of service, and you've gone out there 2 by 2, and you've experienced a lot of things. I want you to keep growing, right? And so since you've learned that, and wow, how's it, let's take this thing to the next level. It's almost like there's always just that little bit more, that little bit more. So we're going to get the exam. So what this miracle that we just saw, since it's in all these gospels, you just get the idea that, aside from the resurrection, here's the greatest thing. This is the greatest testament to the power of Jesus. Jesus works this miracle, 5 loaves and 2 little fish, and after 5,000 men, not to mention the women and the children, have eaten, they gather up 12 baskets of leftovers. Wow. So immediately, so that means on the heels of that amazing miracle, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida. And by the way, remember the last time that they got in a boat under these similar circumstances, he had gotten in the boat with them. This time, he's not going off with them. He sends them ahead. So he puts them in the boat, sends them to the other side, while the text says, latter part of verse 45, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Now, when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now, about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. And they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. Wait, stop. What? Verse 52. They had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. Wait, let's hold on thoughts about Jesus walking on the water for a moment and deal with this statement right here in verse 52. The reason they didn't get it about what Jesus was doing is because they didn't get it about the loaves. What is it about their hearts that was so hardened about the miracle with the loaves?
Brother Ken, I think everything has been a mystery to them till,
Okay.
till after uh, the resurrection of Christ, I think. So in that
So you just
context,
get the sense they're still just kind of confounded about what's happening, even though they have been out on their own and they've seen their own hands work miracles and they've heard their own voices proclaiming the gospel. And they
that's right.
had the sensitivity to help those who were hungry. They've grown, but they don't quite get it all, right? And I have to think Jesus is quite a bit frustrated that as far as they have come, that they won't just keep reaching forward, keep moving ahead, keep growing. Wow, look at the miracle Jesus just did. It's like, we don't get it. We don't. How did he do that? What in the world? We don't know. Where do you get the extra bread from? It's like their heart is hardened in the sense. When your heart is hardened, it means you're not what? When your heart is hard, it means it's not receiving anymore. Their heart, it's like they had gotten to a place where they're a brick wall. They just stopped. And now another extraordinary thing has happened in their midst. Now, does anybody, Mark doesn't give us all the details, and you have to go to Matthew to get the story filled in about, to me, what is even more extraordinary about this event in Jesus's interaction with Peter. But given that John Mark is likely writing from the experiences of Peter, and Peter's most embarrassing moment up until this point is this walking on water incident. Why is it that Mark is just kind of whitewashing this whole thing? Did we lose our connection? We don't know. We're like the disciples. Don't know. Me too. So you know, in Matthew, Jesus is out there in the water, walking on the water. Peter's like, "Hey, is that you, Lord?" He said, "Yeah, it's me." He commands Peter, "Come out on the water." And so, you know, Peter steps out of this boat and he starts to walk on the water. And then he kind of looks around and sees that the storm, the wind is blowing boisterous, and the storm is just the waves. And he takes his eyes off of Jesus. That's how we typically characterize that. And he begins to sink. "Lord, save me," he cries out. And Jesus, of course, reaches out his hand and saves him. "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" This is going to be the atypical example of a lack of faith in the presence of Jesus. "Get out of the boat," the Lord says. "Yes, I'll get out of the boat. I'll serve you. But look at all this dangerous stuff. Oh no, help me." I mean, if that story isn't told over and over and over again about disciples of Jesus, not in boats exactly, but launching out there to do something extraordinary and finding failure and then begging the Lord to help us. That happens over and over and over. Here, Mark says, "You know what? Let's just skip all the drama. Here's what happened." And the disciples still didn't get it. It's frustrating. And the Lord is still so incredibly patient. Opportunities to learn, opportunities again, this whole book is driving to the notion of Jesus being the Son of God. He's just did this incredible miracle with the loaves and the fish. He's walked on the water. Who else could possibly deny that this is true? But they have gotten to a place where it's like they put up the brick wall. We just, Lord, it's too much. We're not getting it. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. And when they came out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him, ran through that whole surrounding region, began to carry about on beds those who were sick to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he entered, into villages, cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces, begged him that they might just touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched him were made well. So the boat ends up landing basically south of Capernaum. People recognize Jesus. He has great celebrity and fame right now. They run and go get their sick and afflicted and they bring them to him. They hadn't been expecting him. So, wow, what a great opportunity. Let's get everybody together. They don't want to waste an opportunity to be with Jesus. They not only brought their own sick, but they spread the word to other villages so that wherever Jesus went, needy people were waiting for him. Truly, the servant was at the beck and call of all kinds of people, and he graciously met their needs. I think it's the next day, according to John, John chapter 6, it's the next day following these events that Jesus gives that sermon concerning the bread of life. I mean, how true to the time was that? "I just fed you with all this bread. Here I am." I mean, they wanted bread, but they didn't want the truth. How like so many people today who want Jesus to help them and to heal them, to do something for them, but not to save and deliver them from their sins. Because in order to be delivered from our sins, we have to do what? Need to have to quit our sinning. We have to quit our sinning. All right.
Brother Ken,
Yes.
you remind me of when I was still at school, at boarding school. A guy, in fact, he is my brother-in-law today. he was throwing stones. So the principal saw him, he's actually totally blind. He was throwing,
Oh,
stones left, right, and center. And then the principal called him and asked him to come to his office because now he's going to get a hiding. Then he decided he's going to use reverse psychology. He asked the principal, "Are you sure that I threw the stones?" Eventually, the principal doubted himself, and that is how he got away. I think the principal thought at that state maybe you should go and see a psychiatrist. Maybe something wrong with his head.
Oh, Isaac, you do have your stories.
Yeah, it's just reflecting to what you just said about the disciples.
Yes,
So,
sir.
I mean,
Absolutely.
a blind person deceiving a person that can see.
That's it. If we were in the book of John, we'd be in chapter 9 right now. I mean, that is true. All right. Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7. Jesus is getting deeper and deeper into the challenges with these religious leaders of his time. Things are becoming very stressful. They're losing their patience. Maybe they thought Jesus would turn their way. Remember, they already kind of introduced that idea when they asked the question about the fasting disciples and so forth. Why aren't you in league with us? Why aren't you doing the same? Mark chapter 7, Jesus is going to get more serious about the reason that there is this division between his mentality for the things of God and their very selfish, man-made religion that they're trying to offer to God, how far they had gone away from the things of God. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, Pharisees and scribes, having come from Jerusalem. Now, when they saw some of his disciples eat bread which was defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. Now, I want to point out this was not a law of Moses thing. This was a tradition that had developed mostly because of a prejudice against Gentiles and the Samaritans. They were afraid maybe I've touched somebody who was defiled in some way, and so I need to wash my hands. That had become a tradition, and a tradition that pretty well nigh was a law. And if they didn't see you washing your hands, then you had broken that law that they had created. Verse 4, when they come from the marketplace, they don't eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they've received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. So he goes into that. It wasn't just their hands, all kinds of things they're washing as a matter of tradition, not necessarily because it needed it. It has become a tradition that has been kind of pressed on folks. And so the Pharisees and the scribes asked Jesus, how do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? He answered and said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. He said to them, all too well, you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father and mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you may have received from me is Corban. That is, it's a gift. It's a gift of God. So we're going to have to take that instead of you benefiting from it. We're going to take that and we're going to dedicate that to God. You know, we're all spiritual and such. And they neglected their parents. Then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. So, in other words, he's making a contrast. He says, okay, you got your hand washing tradition over there, and you may think that's a pretty good deal. Let's see how bad this thing can go. So I know that there is a tradition that you hold wherein you have a mother or father that you need to support financially. But instead of giving the money to your parents and caring for them, you're just saying, oh, well, I'm so religious and upright. It would be better for me to give that money to the work of God. And probably you benefit yourself from that money as opposed to having helped out your parents. You have taken a stipulation that God had made to honor and care for your parents. You've made that a big fat zero of no import at all. You've made it of no effect. And then you've taken your tradition and put it on top of that. He said there are a lot of things that you do like that. Verse 14. When he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. He's like, you can wash your hands all day, but if your heart is wretched, you're wretched. When he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable, because they don't understand. And he said to them, are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him? Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods. And he said, what comes out of a man, that's what defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of man proceed. And look at this list. Evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. He's like, it is a joke. It is a joke for a man who has these iniquities in his heart to insist that he wash his hands constantly in order to remove what defiles him. Oh boy, Jesus looks at their, and that's what this text was alluding to when it said that Jesus saw their hypocrisy. So evil on the inside and presenting such righteousness on the outside. Total hypocrisy. Any comments about that?
So, brother, we had one of the courses we had with congregation with Brother Newman Conchefu from Atari in Zimbabwe, and he was talking about legalism, and I thought what you talk about is the legalistic point of view, saying holding to one thing and believing another.
Yeah, well, that oftentimes when people make a hard line about things, they're doing so out of their own, own struggle. They think, well, I have this problem, so I'm going to hold fast to this certain principle, and you need to also. And that was the hypocrisy in it. And actually, in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus will take these same folks to task, and he will say that, you go and you search far and wide to make disciples, and then you might make them twice as sons of hell as yourselves. In other words, as bad as they are, when they put their own traditions or their own limitations on other people, it actually makes it worse for the one who comes after them. No doubt that that kind of attitude had resulted in the world of darkness that Jesus found himself in. Now, I will say this, that Jesus is talking about traditions that have gone so far as to be recognized not just as tradition, but were being accepted as the Word of God when they really were not. Tradition in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that tradition, when it becomes an authority unto itself, that's when it becomes wrong. In Colossians chapter 2 and verse 8, which is a great text dealing with this very thing, he said, "Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ." A lot of things are helpful, traditions that come to be, procedural things, all those are helpful, but those do not substitute or take the place of the law of God. Neither do they remove what Jesus had been talking about earlier about the Sabbath. Those were tremendous things in and of themselves, but when they stood in the way of love and kindness and helping others, they had actually become more of a burden than a help. So we observe traditions when they are helpful, but when they're not helpful, since they're just traditions, we don't have to follow them. Well, Jesus didn't stop with exposing the Jews' hypocrisy in this text. I mean, he went right for the heart itself. And, those Jews, he says, they're not defiled from on the outside. It's not because they didn't wash their hands that they're defiled. They're defiled because of their own sinful hearts. And no amount of washing on the outside is going to remove the defilement that's on the inside. Still, it seems like the disciples were as much in the dark about this as everybody else was. So Jesus had to explain it to them privately. He says, "Wait a minute, don't you understand that?" And they're like, "No, we don't get it." It's just like, I just want to smack you, Why don't you get this? But you have to remember, I have to remind myself that these disciples do not have the same perspective that you and I have. We're reading along here. Well, we know these things, many of them already. And so we're not very patient with them. We just want to push them along. But perhaps if we had been in their shoes in this time, they've grown up with certain traditions in place. They've lived a certain way according to certain rules all their lives. And now they spent relatively a small amount of time with Jesus, and their whole world is being turned upside down. So I just want to extend a little bit of grace to these disciples and realizing that it must have really been tough to reconcile what Jesus was saying and to follow him and to trust him and believe in him as the Son of God compared to what they had heard all their lives, to what their experience was otherwise. Well, I mentioned to you earlier that, as much as those disciples had been sent on their limited commission to go and to work miracles and to preach the gospel to the Jews, that Jesus also has an eye toward what would ultimately become the sharing of the gospel to the whole world. And that would have included the Gentiles. Jesus, in his ministry, was not afraid, by tradition or otherwise, to interact with Gentiles. And here in quick succession, we're going to have two interviews that Jesus has with Gentiles. One is with a woman, and the other is with a deaf mute man. Verse 24. From there, he arose and went into the region of Tyre and Sidon. When you read about Tyre and Sidon in Matthew chapter 15, you find out that they were wicked cities. He entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. For a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For this saying, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter." And when she had come to her house, she found the demon gone and her daughter lying on the bed. Again, and that word doing two things. One, it's ushering us quickly to the next scene, but it's also connecting the two. It's almost an and. So again, similar to this, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude, put his fingers in his ears, spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." So Jesus, in this section right here, visits two predominantly Gentile regions, Tyre and Sidon and Decapolis. Decapolis literally means the 10 cities. He ministers here to a woman and a man, as I had said before. The Jewish law, separated the Jews from the Gentiles, not because the Jews were better, but because the Jews were different in their covenant relationship with God. So actually, when the temple was built, a wall was created that prevented Gentiles from even entering the Jewish temple courts. And if they were found in the wrong place, they could put them to death. God wanted the Jews to be an example to the Gentiles of the true and the living God, but his people failed in their task in that they weren't even faithful to God. So Jesus has come along, and just like in this interaction, he is tearing down walls of separation. He's removing the spiritual difference that has been made between believing Gentiles and believing Jews. Ultimately, Ephesians 2, of the both coming into one in Jesus Christ. So Jesus heals the woman's daughter at a distance, and he takes this deaf mute away from the crowd. Now, that woman, being a Gentile, she didn't call him son of David like other people cried out. She referred to him as Lord. And Jesus, he answers her. He's not rude to her. He was testing her, strengthening her. I thought it was interesting. He refers to her, and then she in turn refers to herself as a little dog. Now, there's a little bit of the Samaritans as being dogs in the worst possible sense, in their description of them. But here, Jesus and this woman are kind of having a word play. He's not referring to her like most Samaritans were referred to by the Jews. He's referring to her as like a little puppy, and they're using an analogy. So, you're bringing the bread to the children of Israel, bringing the bread to the children. But even the children, as they eat the bread, it falls down on the ground. The little puppies eat from that. Lord, I'm a little puppy. I need some help right here. Jesus marveled at the passion that this woman has for the things that she assumes she's heard that he can do. And because of that, he's touched, and he responds, and he brings about this woman's desire to have the demon removed from her daughter. Similarly, Jesus extends, as it were, crumbs to this man from Decapolis. He couldn't hear, he couldn't speak, but his associates were pretty sure that Jesus could heal his situation. So since the man couldn't hear the word and probably didn't, on the basis of that, have the strength of faith in order to commit himself to the Lord then works an unusual series of things. Uses the spit, his own spittle, touches him, encourages him. And then, did you notice, this is going to be one of several occasions where Jesus' text says that he let out a sigh, just like almost a sense of frustration. I don't know. It reminds us of how maybe he's grieved over the sin that's in the world, maybe this separation that's occurred, the frustrating restraints that have been placed on him, carrying the gospel to the Jews, but man, and these people need me too. So Jesus takes this man away from the crowd and heals him. It's kind of like, just want to keep this quiet. Now, he even encourages the crowd, doesn't he? Keep quiet. Don't say anything about it. But the more he encouraged them not to say anything, the more they talked. I don't know if you thought this or not. I want to put this little notion in your mind, and that is, have you noticed Jesus is going about constantly saying, don't tell anybody about this. Don't tell anybody about this. Don't tell anybody about this. But then, in turn, they go and they tell everybody about it. Contrast that with what you find today. So Jesus was telling them, be quiet, don't tell anybody about it. They do it anyway. Jesus today tells us to go and tell everybody about the good news, go share the gospel, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And what do most people do with that? They tend to keep quiet all on their own. I just find that pretty ironic. Lord, help us to be more faithful. Yes. Nod your head this way. Yes. Help us to be. All right, chapter 8. Wait a minute. Did we just feed 5,000 people? Wasn't that the most extraordinary miracle ever done besides the resurrection of Jesus? Isn't that the one that was told to all the world through all 4 gospels? Isn't that what happened? Yeah, that's right. Well, It's like, remember, in response to that, get over there, Jesus walking on the water, so forth. Disciples' hearts are hardened, they don't get it. All right, well then how about let's try this again. Only two occasions, only two places is this recorded, the feeding of 4,000. Right here in Mark, and then Matthew, in Matthew chapter 15 also covers it. But I'm just going to go ahead and warn you. I would think, if I'd never heard this before, that in the feeding of 4,000, boy, disciples must be all over this. They've already seen Jesus feed 5,000. So what would 4,000 be? And this, no, but maybe this is the moment where their faith is just going to take off and they are just going to be amazing. In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and he said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they've now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they'll faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. Then his disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? Don't you want to just scream right now? What kind of question is that? Didn't he just feed 5,000? I mean, he asked them, how many loaves do you have? Isn't that what he asked them before? What do we have? So the disciples are like, oh no, we're out here in the wilderness. There's no store to go buy any food. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? She's like, well, what do you have? Don't you remember how this works? They said, well, we have seven loaves. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And they set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away immediately, got into the boat with his disciples, and came to the region of Dalmanutha. So, okay, let's talk about Jesus for a second. When Jesus sees a needy multitude, what does he do?
He shows compassion.
He shows absolute compassion. He wants to help them. What can I do to satisfy your need? Remember this idea of Jesus being the servant. We're talking about his service. You're needy. I want to help. So why the 12 were perplexed about feeding this crowd is difficult for me to understand, especially when Jesus had already fed a much larger multitude. Why in the world do you think that it's like they'd never heard of this kind of thing before? Why are they like this?
Suffering from memory loss, I think.
Well, Lord, we're hungry. we're tired. We just really? We've done something like this before? I don't know. You've done so many amazing things. I just didn't remember that. Seriously? Of course, I guess to be fair, I guess I would have to say, you know what? Generally speaking, we do a lot of that too. It's like I read here in these scriptures about all the amazing things Jesus did and all these incredible lessons that he taught. And then there are moments in people's lives when despite all this knowledge and all this experience in the scriptures, and even all the experience that they've had in their own lives, where you've been delivered from this or from that. Now you're facing the current situation, the present situation, and it's like you forget all that God has done for you and you fall into despair, like as though you have no experience with Him at all. I was thinking of Psalm 103. The first couple of verses that start that psalm says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits." Lord, help my soul not to forget what you have done for me. So another great miracle, an amazing thing, the disciples are not getting it. Well, it's not just the disciples that aren't getting it either. Everybody that has seen these miracles that Jesus has done, they've seen it, they've experienced it, and yet it's never enough. And keep in mind, within these crowds constantly are the Pharisees, who are looking for reasons to question Jesus. The scribes and the Pharisees seem to always be there, looking for some fault to claim against Jesus. So in verse 11, it says that the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. Wait, I don't know. I hope you see this as comically as I do. I just want to laugh. I want to scream at the same time. What do you mean you are seeking a sign from Jesus? What is it that he has been doing all this time? I mean, what? So look at this. If this isn't a classic response to such infantile thinking and acting. Verse 12, here's that phrase again. He sighed deeply in his spirit. Yes, I heard someone trying to break through there.
They also claim to believe that he is not from heaven. So now they want a sign from heaven, from him.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what they did. Yeah, they're going to want, like the bread from heaven business that Moses was able to do. It's like, now you're working all these miracles, but there are certain things we're looking for, not what you're doing. We're looking for something else. So show us that. It's maddening, the depth of ignorance that is on display here. And so it's no surprise, verse 12, that he sighs deeply in his spirit. Now, and by the way, just on the side note, do you guys ever do that? I guess maybe it's because I'm getting older. I don't know, because I don't really notice it that much. But my wife will occasionally say something to the effect, "Why did you just do that?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" She says, "You're sighing." I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, you're just sitting up there, and all of a sudden you just go like that." I think most
My
often,
reaction is like a snake, brother. I'm doing, shh, you know.
maybe so. Sometimes we sigh because we just don't have the words, right? It's just like, oh, please.
Wish.
And so he sighs deeply in his spirit. and he says, why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. So Jesus and his disciples, they make it back to Galilee, and they're met by the Pharisees who want this sign. You know, the feeding of the 5,000, that wasn't good enough for them. Moses brought bread from heaven. What can you do? Well, wait, I'll tell you what I can do. I can take 5,000 and I can feed them with 5 loaves and have 12 baskets full of the remnants left over. I tell you what else I can do. I can take a little bit of bread that they find for 4,000 and I can make it so that there are 7 baskets of food left over. Oh, but we want to see something like Moses did. What? Wait, what? So here's Jesus saying, it's like that it is never enough. It is never enough. His only response is to leave again and go to the other shore of the sea. It's like in the beginning, Jesus has a lot of patience with the lack of faith. Of course, they don't have faith. They haven't seen anything. I haven't taught them anything. So of course they don't have faith. But after all this time, you're following around after me. You see the miracles, you hear the lessons, you eat the food, but you still don't have any faith. It's like Jesus has no faith in the kind of faith in people that require or depend upon signs and wonders. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of what Jesus said to Thomas, you know, when Thomas required that Jesus prove he was resurrected from the dead by showing the nail prints and the wound in his side. And Jesus is like, well, you know, you believe, Thomas, and I appreciate you, Thomas, but you believe because you've seen the evidence. Blessed are those who are going to believe who don't have the privilege of these things. It's like there's just so much of it that you can take, even if you're the Son of God. There is only so much of that you can take before it just becomes really, really frustrating. So Jesus begins to warn his disciples. You know, these Pharisees aren't getting it. And because they're not getting it and they're discounting me to such a degree that you need to be very, very careful about your interaction with these people. And so, verse 13, he left them and getting into the boat. And by the way, don't you wish that you had had a boat business back then and you could have rented Jesus a boat? Because you would have made a lot of money about him getting in and out of boats. It's just, I'd never really noticed that this much until I started rereading Mark. And I was like, man, Jesus is in and out of the boats. But he left them and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. It's just like going back and forth. Now the disciples, oh no. We had 12 baskets left over from the first feed. We have 7 baskets left over from the second feed. We get on the boat. Hey, anybody got any snacks? The disciples had forgotten to take bread. And they didn't have any more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. And then he charged them saying, oh, can you imagine Jesus is kind of chuckling right now, maybe a little bit? He's like, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of Herod. And they're like, wait, what? They started reasoning. They started reasoning among themselves and they said, did he say that because we don't have any bread? Is that what this is all about? They're just scratching their heads like, I don't know. But Jesus, being aware of it, he says to them, why do you reason? Because you have no bread. Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Are you still at the place where you're not learning anything at all? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of fragments? How many did you take up? They said, oh yeah, we remember that, 12. Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? 7. So he said to them, how is it you do not understand? Seriously, is it a big deal that you didn't bring but 1 loaf of bread? Don't you think I could feed you guys out of that in this small little boat? I fed 5,000. I fed 4,000. There's only 12 of you, and you have a whole loaf of bread. It's like, please get this. Is your heart still that hard that you don't get it? So, yeah, it's true. They did leave quickly and they didn't have time to pack a lunch. And it leads to an argument about whose fault it is, who didn't bring the bread, who didn't bring the bread. But seriously, you are with Jesus. Why would you fret and worry over something so trivial? Instead, he says, and boy, Jesus takes a kind of a comical, at least as I'm looking at it, it's a pretty funny scene. He takes what is so childish about them and he turns it into a deep lesson. He teaches them about the hypocrisy of the leaven that the Pharisees are and of the worldly compromise that the Herodians are. Spiritually, those poor disciples really lacked understanding. Do you not get it yet? And the answer would be, well, no. And I think Isaac pointed out earlier that really we need to hang in there with these disciples because they really never got it until after the resurrection of Jesus. They just had such a hard time dealing with all that Jesus was.
You know, Jerry Hogg. I don't know if you ever met Jerry.
Yes, I do.
He one day had a sermon that said, we all going to walk around with flat foreheads in heaven. Okay? Because we all going to go like, why? What did I about it?
I love that. That's cute. Yeah, you know, just an observation. Maybe these disciples were doing that too. They're trying to be all like we're disciples of Jesus and we are something else. We've got this. And maybe we just, even now, we just take ourselves way too seriously. How many times in our futile attempts to try and do something extraordinary does God, in his amazing place of observation, just kind of laugh at how simple and weak we really are? So I don't know. Maybe that's true of me only. I don't know, but it seems like we just take ourselves too seriously sometimes. And Jesus is trying so hard to bring these guys along. But, if they would just let go a little bit and just observe, see what's happening, they would be so much better off. Then he came to Bethsaida and, oh, yes,
I was
yes.
thinking of Psalm 46:10, just as I am. Is that I think it's 46:10.
Yes.
And just to be in the moment, live in the moment, and not think, as you said, just be in the moment.
I do too, but you know what? As soon as you said that, and you're right, the sentiment, just as I am. But that song's got like 20 verses to it. It's just like, it's just like one verse ought to that would capture it. But it's just like on and on and on, like just as I am, and here's how I am. And I remember one time, I don't know if you knew Winkler was. Wendell Winkler was a preacher of many years ago He's actually written lots of books for Bible classes and so forth. But Wendell Winkler was a tremendous preacher, and he was at a lectureship one time where I was the song leader. And so I had announced the invitation song, and it was that one, Just As I Am. And it dealt with the lesson that he was preaching. And I don't remember the substance of it, the particulars, but I do remember that the ultimate theme of it was just what you're talking about. Just take me where I am right now. And before, as soon as he finished, he turned to me and he said, just sing the first verse. And so that's what we did. But the whole idea was, this is supposed to be expressing about us being right there in that moment and accepting us where we are right here. But we're going to go on and on and on about this. Stop it. And these guys, if they, like you say, if they would just come on, let's just be right here for right now. Lord, help me to be where I am right now in the moment too. Okay, so another miracle coming. Things are going to start getting better, I'm sure. He came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to him, begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and he said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in town. Now, this is the second of two miracles that only Mark records. The other one is the healing of the deaf mute. In both of these instances, Jesus took the person away from the crowd, and here he actually takes him right out of the town, probably to avoid the publicity, I'm assuming, and maybe to let the town know that it was under the judgment of God. Bethsaida was one of those towns, Matthew 11, that was going to be under the judgment of God. And so, I'm going to heal you, but you don't need this town. You need to get away from here. Maybe that's the idea. But this is, to me, the thing about this story is it's the only gradual miracle that is ever recorded that Jesus did. He touches the guy, he says, well, what do you see? He says, well, it's like basically I see some things, but not very clearly. I see men walking, look kind of like trees. But then he touches him again and he's healed. Mark doesn't do this by accident. And you know what we were just talking about how it seems like the disciples, they get it, sort of, but the light hadn't quite come on in them yet. It's like they see a little. Jesus keeps showing it to them. They don't quite get it, but eventually they will get it, and they'll see. I don't know. I mean, I'll just tell you right now, I don't know for sure, because the text doesn't tell us why it is that Jesus had to touch this guy twice in order for him to be completely healed. But if I'm taking cues from Mark, I'm kind of getting the idea that, maybe the gradual enlightenment of this blind man was an illustration of the gradual spiritual enlightenment that he's seeing in the people and in his own disciples. But what do you think about that? Hello? Hello. Anybody out there?
Makes sense, brother Ken.
Oh, so I figured it out. Wow, I need to write a commentary. No, I mean, I don't know if that's it or not.
I think you
it's
need a blind man to
strange.
answer that question anyway.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Isaac, for your confidence.
You will.
But that's a thought I have about it. But on the heels of that, now thank you, Isaac, but that we're leading to something, because on the heels of that, guess what's going to happen? It's going to be like the light switches on. So we went from darkness, not sure, still not understanding, have this healing of this blind man in two-part stages, not quite, and then amazing. Guess what? Peter is going to confess Jesus, beginning in verse 27, the ultimate expression. Now, Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road, he asked the disciples, saying to them, "Who do men say that I am?" So they answered, "John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, others, one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." Then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him. Okay, now what I want to say right now is, yay! Yay! They finally get it. You're the Son of God. You are. Where'd they get that idea? Matthew 16, verse 17. They didn't get it from the people. They got that from the Father. God taught them that. Matthew 16, verse 17. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Now, he is not saying, oh, last night, I know you had this vision and you heard, not that. But that over all of this time and all these experiences, God has been showing you who I am. And it's, we can't quite see. We see him walking as a tree. But now we got it. You're the Son of God. Verse 31, and he began to teach them. Now that you get this, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke this word openly. Then Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." Well, most Jews, Orthodox Jews, believed that their Messiah was going to come, but they believed the Messiah was coming in power and glory and going to defeat all their enemies, not be defeated by their enemies. Defeat the enemy, not be defeated. He had previously been hinting at his death, but this time Jesus clearly teaches it. Here it is. I'm going to die, and I'm going to be raised from the dead. And Peter's confusion here, Peter's the one who confesses he's the Christ, but although I believe that, I'm not so sure about this whole business about you dying. Peter's confusion originates with the devil, who doesn't want us to understand the doctrine of the cross. Peter wanted the glory, but he didn't want the suffering that leads to glory. Probably why, we're actually, after this study, we'll be looking at 1st and 2nd Peter in both of those books. Peter has a lot to say about suffering and glory. Ultimately, Jesus had to go to that cross. So Satan, get out of this conversation. Not happening. when he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. So we become disciples of Jesus by surrendering everything that we have to him. And then we take up our cross and we follow him. We give him our life. So if we're living for ourselves, we're going to lose our life, but he'll be ashamed of us. But if we live for Christ, we're going to save our lives and we're going to glorify him. Discipleship is something that saves us from the tragedy of a wasted life. Is there going to be suffering in taking up your cross to follow Jesus? Yes. But that suffering always leads to glorification with Jesus. Hey, that's the end of chapter 8. And that's the end of our time together. So thank you so much for your attention. I have a little quiz for you. It's similar to the one that you had, Tuesday. Just a few little questions. We already reviewed that at the beginning, so I'm expecting you're all going to make 100, although you look really tired and exhausted and ready to go home, go to bed. So take your little test, and then you can do that. Yay, we're so glad. And then, Lord willing, if we all live through the weekend, then we will meet again on Monday. We're halfway through. Oh, so glad. And I encourage you, be reading ahead. And this is such a great book. It's very short, only takes like an hour and a half to read through it. So just knock that thing out and familiarize yourself with it. Thanks for letting me share some of these things with you. And thank you so much for all your comments. You guys are,
Brother Ken, before you
yes.
go, I was thinking of the miracles. Now, because the miracles happened and they even rejected Christ. Today, God allows trials and tribulations so that we can remain faithful. That is our test today.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that, Isaac. All right. I love you guys, and I'll see you on Monday. Good luck on your test.
Thank you, Brother Ken. Have a
You're
blessed
welcome.
weekend.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good luck.
Good night, everybody.
Okay.
Bye, Bella.
Bye, Peter. Bye.
Bye.